For 55 years, Earl Perkins farmed 400 acres outside Hadley, drove the same rusted pickup, and never once asked anyone for help. He had $14 in his checking account the morning he walked into First National Bank and asked for a $5,000 loan. The new branch manager took one look at Earl's cracked boots and calloused hands, glanced at the balance on his screen, and said no. Didn't check another file. Didn't ask a single question. Earl nodded, stood up, and walked to the front counter. He asked the head teller, a woman who'd known him 30 years, to pull up his other account. What appeared on that screen was something no one in Hadley could have imagined. But this story doesn't start in a bank. It starts on a Saturday morning in April, when the air smelled like wet dirt and fresh-cut grass, and Earl Perkins climbed into his 1994 Ford pickup and drove the 7 miles from his farm into town. He did this every Saturday. Had done it every Saturday since Helen died. The truck's paint had faded from blue to something closer to gray. The passenger seat had a permanent dip in it from 50 years of Helen sitting in the same spot. Earl never moved the seat back, never adjusted the mirror she'd angled toward herself for checking her lipstick. Some mornings he glanced at it and caught nothing but the road behind him, and that was enough to remind him she wasn't there. He parked in front of the diner at 7:15, same as always. The bell above the door jingled when he walked in. "Morning, Earl." Louise was already pouring his coffee. She had his cup on the counter before he sat down. Black, no sugar. "Morning, Louise." "Eggs and toast, if it's not too much trouble." She smiled. "It's never trouble, Earl. You know that." He sat at the counter, third stool from the left. The vinyl was cracked and the padding had gone flat years ago. But it was his stool. Nobody in town sat there on Saturday mornings. Everybody knew. Louise set his plate down a few minutes later. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, a small pile of hash browns she always added without charging him. Earl ate slowly. He watched the street through the window. A few cars passed. The town was quiet on weekend mornings. Not empty, just unhurried. "How's the planting?" Louise asked, wiping down the counter. "Coming along. Got the south field in last week. Soybeans again? You ever get tired of soybeans?" Earl took a sip of coffee. "Soybeans have been good to me. No reason to stop now." Louise laughed. She didn't know how true that was. Nobody in that diner did. Earl left $3 on the counter for a $2 breakfast. He did that every week. Louise always told him it was too much. He always told her it wasn't enough. He stepped outside and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up the street toward the bank. The morning sun caught the glass front of the building and turned it bright white. Earl reached into his shirt pocket and touched the pair of reading glasses folded there. Helen's glasses. Wire frames, a small scratch on the left lens. He carried them every day. "All right, Helen," he said under his breath. "Let's go see about this new fella." The bank was 3 blocks from the diner. Earl walked. His knees weren't what they used to be, but he didn't carry a cane. Helen had told him once that the day he started leaning on a cane was the day he'd start feeling old, and he figured she was right about that. She'd been right about most things. He pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. Doris saw him first. She'd been behind that counter for 31 years. Gray hair pulled back, bifocals on a chain around her neck. She remembered every account number and every grandchild's birthday in a town of 2,200 people. "Well, look who it is." She smiled wide. "Earl Perkins. Haven't seen you in here since January. Haven't needed anything since January. What brings you in today?" Earl glanced toward the glass-walled office in the back. A young man sat behind the desk typing on a laptop. Dark suit, clean-shaven, a haircut that cost $40 in a city. "That the new manager?" Earl asked. Doris's smile faded slightly. "Marcus Webb, transferred in about 6 weeks ago. He any good?" She looked at Earl over the top of her glasses and lowered her voice. "He's efficient. I'll say that much." Earl nodded. He understood what she wasn't saying. "I'd like to talk to him about a loan," Earl said. Something shifted behind Doris's eyes. She knew Earl's accounts. All of them. She knew exactly how much money sat in the Perkins family trust because she'd watched Helen build it deposit by deposit for decades. She knew what a $5,000 loan request would look like to a man who only saw numbers on a screen. "Earl," she said carefully, "you sure about that?" "I'm sure." She studied him for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Marcus, I've got a customer here who'd like to discuss a loan. Earl Perkins. He's been with us over 50 years. She hung up and nodded toward the office. "Go on in." Earl walked across the carpet. His boots left faint dust marks on the dark blue pile. He knocked once on the open door. Marcus Webb looked up from his laptop. He was younger than Earl expected. 33, 34 maybe. He stood and shook Earl's hand across the desk. Good grip. Quick smile. Mr. Perkins, have a seat. What can I do for you? Earl lowered himself into the chair. It was one of those modern chairs with thin padding and chrome arms. He set his hands on his knees. I need a loan, Earl said. $5,000. Marcus nodded and turned to his computer. Earl watched his eyes move across the screen. Pulling up your account now, Marcus said. He clicked a few times. His expression didn't change, but his typing slowed. Earl knew what he was seeing. A checking account with $14.37. A savings account with $812. No credit cards. No investment accounts under that profile. Just the numbers of a man who looked exactly the way Earl looked right now. Old overalls, worn boots, calloused hands, 78 years of weather on his face. Marcus leaned back. And what would the loan be for? Farm equipment. My combine needs a new header. I see. Marcus folded his hands on the desk. What collateral would you be offering? My word, Earl said. Marcus paused. He glanced at the screen again, cleared his throat. Mr. Perkins, I appreciate you coming in, but based on what I'm seeing, your current balances don't support a $5,000 unsecured loan. Your checking shows $14. Your savings has just over $800. That's right. And at your age, without a steady income source showing in our system, Marcus straightened a pen on his desk. I can't approve this. The numbers just aren't there. He paused. We do have a senior assistance program through the county. I could get you the paperwork for that if you'd like. The room went quiet. Earl looked at Marcus for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hurt. He just looked at him the way a farmer looks at a fence that's been set in the wrong spot. Not the fence's fault exactly. It just wasn't where it should be. Thank you for your time, Earl said. He put his hands on the armrests and pushed himself up. His right knee locked for a moment. Marcus stood too. Mr. Perkins, I really am sorry. If your situation changes, it won't, Earl said quietly. He walked out of the office. Marcus watched him go, already reaching for his next file. Earl went to the teller counter. Doris was waiting. She'd been watching through the glass the entire time and her jaw was tight. How'd it go? She asked, though she already knew. About how you expected? Earl? It's all right, Doris. It's not all right. Earl leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. The bank was nearly empty. One other customer at the far desk filling out a deposit slip. Doris, pull up my other account. She looked at him. Her expression changed. Not surprise. She'd been waiting for this. You sure? She asked. I'm sure. She turned to her computer and typed. She knew the account number by heart. The screen changed. Doris glanced at it, then looked at Earl. He nodded once. She turned the monitor, not toward Earl, toward the glass office behind him, where Marcus Webb sat at his desk reviewing his next file. The screen showed the Earl and Helen Perkins Family Trust. Balance, $12,417,832. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Marcus looked up. His eyes found the monitor Doris had turned toward him. He squinted. Then he stood. Earl didn't look back. He kept his eyes on Doris. I didn't need the money, he said. His voice was steady and quiet. I needed to see the man. Doris's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just nodded. I'll be back Monday, Earl said. I need to talk to someone about a transfer, a large one, but not with him. He tilted his head slightly toward the office. Not yet. Behind them, Marcus had come to his office doorway. His face had gone white. He stared at the number on the screen, then at Earl's back, then at the number again. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Earl tapped the counter once with his knuckle and walked out. The bell chimed behind him. Doris turned the monitor back. She looked at Marcus, still standing in his doorway. I told you to look at the full profile, she said. She turned back to her computer. The conversation was over. Marcus stood there for a long time. Outside, Earl sat in his truck in the parking lot. He didn't start the engine. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out Helen's reading glasses, held them in both hands, the wire frames cool against his palms. The parking lot was nearly empty. A sparrow landed on the hood and looked at him through the windshield. Well, Helen, he said, you were right about this one. The old manager would have known. This new fella doesn't see past the boots. He turned the glasses over in his hands. But I've been thinking about what you wanted. The community center. I know you said to wait until I found the right people, I think I've waited long enough. The sparrow hopped twice and flew off. I'm going to build it, Helen. $2 million, just like we talked about. And I'm going to put your name on it. He sat a while longer. The sun was higher now, warming the cab through the windshield. He could smell the vinyl of the old seats and the faint trace of lavender hand cream Helen used to keep in the glove box. He'd never cleaned it out. The bottle was still in there, half empty, the cap cracked. Earl put the glasses back in his pocket. He started the engine. The truck coughed twice and turned over. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed east toward the farm. The fields stretched out on both sides of the road, green and flat as far as he could see. His fields. 400 acres of soybeans and corn, and the back 40 where the mineral rights alone had paid out more than most people in the county would see in a lifetime. Nobody knew. That had always been the point. Helen had been an accountant before they married. She understood money the way Earl understood soil. He knew seeds and weather and the patience a crop demanded. She knew interest rates and tax shelters and what 50 years of careful investing could build. Together, they'd made something enormous without making a sound. Earl drove home with the windows down. He thought about Marcus sitting in that office, staring at a number he never expected. He thought about Doris. He thought about Helen, the way she'd sit in the same passenger seat and read the newspaper aloud on drives, her glasses sliding down her nose. He missed her every day. Not in the big, dramatic way, in the small way. The empty chair at breakfast, the silence where her voice should be. The reading glasses in his pocket because putting them in a drawer felt too much like giving up. The truck bumped over the gravel drive and pulled up to the farmhouse. White paint, green shutters, a porch that wrapped around two sides. Helen's garden out front still blooming because Earl watered it every evening. He climbed out and stood in the yard. The brown mutt from the next farm over had wandered into his driveway again. Earl scratched its head and walked up the porch steps. On the kitchen table sat a folder he'd been putting together for months. Legal papers, architectural sketches on graph paper, a photograph of the old community center before it burned down 4 years ago. Helen had loved that building. She'd run the summer reading program there for 15 years. She'd organized the Thanksgiving dinners. She'd taught an evening accounting class for anyone who wanted to learn how to balance a checkbook. When it burned down, something in the town went quiet. People stopped gathering. The empty lot behind the post office became just another patch of weeds. Helen had talked about rebuilding it. For years she'd talked about it. Even in the hospital, even in those last months when the cancer was taking everything. "Promise me, Earl," she'd said, holding his hand in the room where he'd slept in a chair every night for 7 months. "Build it. Not for me, for them." He'd promised. 2 years later, sitting in the kitchen they'd shared for half a century, he was going to keep it. Earl opened the folder and spread the papers across the table. He'd call the lawyer in the next town on Monday, set up the fund properly, get it started. He picked up the photograph, Helen standing in front of the old community center. 1998. She was holding a stack of books for the reading program. She looked happy. She always looked that way when she was doing something for someone else. Earl set the photo down and looked out the window at his fields. $14 in his checking account, $12 million in the trust, and a promise he'd carried for 2 years. He pulled out a pencil and started writing notes on the back of one of the sketches, square footage, room layouts, where the kitchen should go, where Helen's reading room would be. He'd need to talk to Frank on Monday, too. Frank would want to be part of this. He was still writing when the sun moved past the window and the kitchen went dim. He didn't get up to turn on a light, just kept working, the pencil scratching against paper in the quiet house, filling in the margins of a building his wife had dreamed about, and a town that didn't yet know what was coming. Monday morning, Earl drove into town early. He had 3 stops to make. The first was the hardware store. Frank was behind the register, sorting lag bolts into bins. Same thing he'd been doing for 40 years. 80 years old, built square and solid, with hands that had gripped tools since before most people in town were born. Earl. Frank looked up. "Heard something interesting at church yesterday." "That right. Dorothy Nelson told me you walked into the bank Saturday and turned Marcus Webb white as a bedsheet." Earl picked up a box of wood screws and studied it. "News travels. In this town, it sprints." Earl set the box down. "I went in for a loan. 5,000. He said no. And then I had Doris show him the trust balance." Frank set down the bolt in his hand. "How much did he see?" "All of it." Frank whistled. 12 million. And change." "Why, Earl? You could have just walked out." Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The ones who help you when they think you've got nothing, those are the ones worth trusting. I needed to know what kind of man was sitting in that office. And he's not the kind I need. Not yet, anyway. Frank leaned on the counter. Not yet. So what do you need him for? Helen's community center. Frank's hands went still. I'm doing it, Earl said. Going to see a lawyer today. Setting up the fund. $2 million. Frank stared at him. Then he walked around the counter and hugged him, just grabbed him, right there between the socket sets and the plumbing aisle. Frank was not a hugging man. Hadn't been since his own wife's funeral 6 years ago. Helen would be so damn happy, Frank said, his voice rough. I know. Frank pulled back and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What do you need from me? Keep it quiet. The bank part is already out. The community center stays between us until the paperwork's done. A week, maybe 2. Done. Earl left the hardware store and drove 20 miles to the next town. The law office was a small brick building between a dentist and a barber shop. Helen had used this lawyer years ago to update the trust documents. She'd told Earl he was thorough, didn't waste time, and didn't charge for time he didn't spend. That was enough. Earl sat down in the small office and set the folder on the desk, the same folder from his kitchen table, now with 3 pages of handwritten notes tucked inside. I want to establish a charitable fund, he said, for a community center, named after my late wife, Helen Perkins. $2 million from the family trust. The lawyer opened the folder and began reading. Earl sat quietly while he worked. He didn't fidget. He'd spent 55 years waiting for crops to grow. He knew how to be patient. The money in the trust had come from 3 places. The first was mineral rights on the back 40 acres. A natural gas company bought them in 2004 for $3.2 million. Helen had insisted on getting the land surveyed after reading about gas deposits in the county paper. Earl would have let it go. Helen wouldn't. The second was a seed patent. Earl had spent years developing a drought-resistant soybean hybrid in test plots along the creek behind the barn. 6 generations of plants, soil chemistry notebooks in handwriting so small you needed a magnifying glass to read. When a major agricultural company came looking for new genetics, Helen negotiated the licensing deal. Royalties had been paying out every year since. The third was Helen herself. Every dollar that didn't go toward feed, seed, or taxes, she invested. Quietly, carefully. For 50 years, she had a degree in accounting and the same patience her husband brought to farming. Where Earl waited on crops, Helen waited on compound interest. It was the largest portion of the trust now. They'd never changed how they lived. Same house, same truck, same overalls. Helen used to say the money wasn't theirs to spend. It was theirs to use. The lawyer looked up after 20 minutes. This is straightforward. We'll set up a dedicated fund with disbursement controls. You'll want a small board of trustees for construction oversight. I'll pick the board myself. That's your right. I'll have the documents ready Thursday. Earl shook his hand and left. Back in town, the story had already grown legs. Doris hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. The customer filling out a deposit slip on Saturday had watched the whole thing. By Sunday afternoon, every pew at church had heard some version of it. By Monday morning, it had reached the diner, the post office, and every front porch on the main street. The details shifted with each telling. Some said Earl had $50 million. Others said $100. One version had Marcus begging Earl not to leave. None of them were accurate, but all of them carried the same core. The old farmer was rich, and the new banker had made a fool of himself. Louise heard it from 3 different customers before the breakfast rush ended. Earl Perkins, she said to the third one, a woman from the church choir. Our Earl, $12 million sitting in the bank this whole time. Louise looked at the third stool from the left. His stool. She thought about all those Saturday mornings. $2 eggs, $3 tip. A man who never complained, never bragged, never asked for anything. Something turned in her chest, but she couldn't name it yet. That evening, she was wiping tables after the dinner rush when 2 older women sat in the corner booth. Louise brought them coffee and overheard them talking. Remember when the Hendersons lost their boy? One of them said, car accident, 2008. Course I remember. They couldn't afford the funeral. Insurance had lapsed. Somebody paid the whole thing. Casket, flowers, the reception at the church hall. Anonymous. Jim Henderson found out later it was Earl. Earl Perkins. Earl Perkins? The other woman shook her head slowly. When my sister-in-law needed surgery, an envelope showed up at her house. $3,000 cash. No name, no note. She never found out who sent it. They looked at each other. Louise stood behind the counter, rag in hand, perfectly still. 5 years ago, her daughter had been in the hospital, leukemia. The treatments worked, but the bills came faster than Louise could handle. Double shifts. selling whatever she could spare, still falling behind. Then one day the billing office called. Balance zero. Every bill, every procedure, every night in that room. Paid in full. Anonymous donor. Louise had begged them to say who. They couldn't. She'd spent 5 years wondering. She looked at his empty stool. The $3 tip on a $2 breakfast. The quiet man who carried his dead wife's reading glasses in his shirt pocket. Her eyes burned. She wasn't sure yet, but something in her gut already knew. At the bank, Marcus had arrived at 7:30 Monday morning. An hour before anyone else, he'd pulled up Earl's full customer profile, the one he should have opened on Saturday. Everything was there: the trust account, the mineral rights income, the seed patent royalties. Doris had flagged it in the internal notes years ago. Priority client, full review required for any transaction. He'd never read the notes. At 10 o'clock, Doris knocked on his office door. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Come in." She stepped inside and closed the door. She didn't sit down. "I want to tell you about Earl Perkins," she said, "and I need you to listen." Marcus nodded. "I've worked at this bank since before you were born. I was here when Earl and Helen opened that trust. I watched Helen come in every month with a deposit. Sometimes $50, sometimes $500, whatever they had extra. I watched it grow from nothing to what you saw on Saturday." She paused. "Earl has never missed a tax payment in 55 years. Never bounced a check. Never asked for an extension or a favor he didn't earn. He's the most reliable customer this bank has ever had." Marcus didn't speak. "Sometimes the richest man in town is the one nobody notices," Doris said. "You looked at his boots and decided he wasn't worth your time. That's what happened here." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I know." Marcus said quietly, "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm telling you so you understand. Earl didn't come in to embarrass you. That's not who he is. He came in to find out if you were someone he could trust." "Trust with what?" "That's not for me to say." She left and closed the door behind her. Marcus sat in his office for a long time after that. He thought about his father, a mechanic in a town not much bigger than this one. Oil-stained work shirts with his name stitched on the pocket, a pickup with rust on the fenders. Marcus had been embarrassed by him as a teenager. Took different routes to school so his friends wouldn't see the shop. Never let his father pick him up out front. His father never said a word about it, just kept working, kept paying the tuition, kept showing up every morning. Marcus hadn't thought about that in years. That night, he called his wife from the small apartment the bank was renting for him above the hardware store. "How was your day?" she asked. He could hear their daughter laughing in the background. "I made a bad mistake," Marcus said. He told her everything: the old farmer, the loan, the denial, the $12 million on the screen. Doris's words, the quiet look on Earl's face when he stood up from the chair. His wife was silent when he finished. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "I don't know yet." "Figure it out, Marcus, because it sounds like you owe that man more than an apology." He hung up and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Through the window he could see the main street, empty and still. A dog crossed under the streetlight. The town was so quiet he could hear wind in the trees. 300 miles away, in a 14th-floor apartment in Chicago, Dale Perkins sat at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, surrounded by papers he didn't want to look at. Bank statements, collection notices, a letter from a lawyer about a real estate deal that had gone sideways 6 months ago and taken most of his savings with it. Dale was 48. He'd left town at 18 and never really come back. College, business degree, corporate consulting, good salary. A life that looked solid from the outside and felt empty when he sat alone in his apartment at night. He hadn't been home in 3 years. Not since his mother's funeral. He told himself it was because he was busy. Because the drive was long. The truth was simpler. He'd spent 30 years building something designed to prove he was more than a farmer's son. And now that it was falling apart, he couldn't bring himself to call the one person who would have helped without a single question asked. His phone rang. Frank. Dale. Same voice as always. Gravel and warmth. "Frank, it's late." "Calling anyway. Your father walked into the bank on Saturday and did something you need to hear about." Frank told him, the loan, the denial, the trust balance on the screen. Marcus going pale. Earl walking out without raising his voice. Dale listened. He didn't interrupt. "There's more," Frank said. "He's building a community center. Your mother's name on it. $2 million. Dale closed his eyes. "He promised Helen," Frank said. "Before she passed, the old center burned down and she wanted it rebuilt. He's been carrying this since the hospital." Dale pressed his fingers against his eyelids. His throat was tight. "Why are you calling me, Frank?" "'Cause your father won't. He hasn't asked you for a damn thing in 3 years and he's not going to start now." But he's doing this alone, Dale. He shouldn't have to start now. But he's doing this alone, Dale. He shouldn't have to. Your mother would want you there, Frank said. You know that. Dale looked at the papers on his table. The bank statements, the collection letters, everything he built to get away from where he started. I'll think about it, he said. Don't think too long. Frank hung up. Dale sat in the quiet apartment. The city hummed outside. A siren faded somewhere far below. He picked up his phone and opened the airline app. There was a flight Friday morning to the regional airport. $189, one way. He thought about his father sitting in that bank, $14 in checking, $12 million in the trust, wearing the same boots he'd worn since Dale was in high school. He thought about his mother's reading glasses in that shirt pocket. He thought about the last time he'd seen his father, standing on the farmhouse porch after the funeral. One hand raised in a wave Dale barely returned before pulling out of the driveway. He pressed the button. Seat 12A. Friday morning. He was going home. Dale drove into town just after noon on Friday. He'd rented a car at the regional airport and taken the highway south through farm country. The main street was shorter than he remembered. Hardware store, diner, bank, post office, 4 blocks of storefronts, and then open road. He'd walked these sidewalks every day for 18 years and couldn't believe how small it all looked from behind a windshield. He slowed at the corner behind the post office. The empty lot where the community center used to stand was overgrown with weeds and crabgrass. A chain-link fence sagged along one side. He remembered the building. Red brick, white trim, a covered porch where people sat in folding chairs during the summer concerts his mother organized. She'd run programs there for 15 years. Now it was just dirt and weeds. Dale kept driving. 2 miles past the edge of town, he turned onto the gravel road that led to the farm. The fields were green on both sides. Soybeans, probably. He used to be able to tell. He couldn't anymore. The farmhouse appeared around the last curve. White paint, green shutters. His mother's garden still blooming out front. Dale pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. Earl was on the porch. He sat in the wooden chair on the left, the one that had always been his. Helen's chair was on the right, empty. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was looking out at the fields, same as he always did in the afternoons. He didn't stand when Dale stepped out of the car. He just watched his son walk across the yard, up the steps, and stop at the top. They looked at each other. Dale was taller than his father but felt smaller standing there. He'd rehearsed things to say on the flight. Apologies, explanations. They all felt hollow now. Hey, Dad. Earl set his coffee on the porch railing. He stood up slowly, his right knee catching for a moment. Dale. They stood 3 feet apart. Dale opened his mouth to say something and couldn't find the words. Earl stepped forward and put his arms around his son. Not a tight hug. Not a dramatic one, just steady. Dale felt his father's bony shoulders through the flannel shirt, the calluses on the hands pressed against his back. Dad, I'm sorry I haven't. You're here, Earl said. That's enough. He held on for a few more seconds, then stepped back and picked up his coffee. Hungry? Earl asked. Yeah, good. I made soup. They went inside. The kitchen looked the same. Same table, same chairs, same window over the sink. Helen's apron still hung on the hook by the stove. Dale saw it, and something caught in his chest. Earl ladled soup into 2 bowls and set them on the table. They ate without much talk. Potato and ham. Helen's recipe. Dale had eaten it 1,000 times growing up and hadn't thought about it in years. After lunch, Earl took him outside. They walked the property together. Earl pointed out changes. A new fence along the north line, the drainage ditch behind the barn, the test plots along the creek where he still grew experimental seed varieties, smaller now than they used to be. Frank told me about the trust, Dale said carefully. The money. Earl nodded. He didn't look surprised. $12 million, Dad. I had no idea. Your mother didn't want people knowing. Neither did I. How long? The trust started with the mineral rights sale in '04. But Helen was investing before that. She started the year we got married. Dale shook his head. You lived in the same house, drove the same truck, wore the same clothes. Being rich never changed who we were, Earl said. It just gave us more ways to help. They stopped at the edge of the south field. Earl pulled a folder from under his arm. He'd been carrying it since they left the house. He opened it on the hood of the truck and spread out the sketches. This is what I'm building, he said. Dale looked at the drawings, floor plans in Earl's cramped handwriting. A main hall, a kitchen, 2 meeting rooms, a library. Your mother's community center, Earl said. $2 million from the trust. Lawyers drawing up the fund this week. Dale picked up one of the pages and held it close. His father had drawn a small room off the main hall and labeled it in pencil. Helen's reading room. Dale set the paper down. He didn't trust his voice. She wanted this more than anything, Earl said. She used to say a town was just a bunch of buildings until people had a place to come together. She wanted to give them that. Dale looked at his father, 78 years old, standing in a soybean field with architectural sketches on graph paper, planning to spend $2 million on a building for a town of 2,200 people. Overalls, boots, flannel shirt, Helen's glasses in his pocket. Same as always. Dale had spent 30 years running from this. From the farm, the truck, the small town life. He'd wanted offices and conference rooms and a zip code that impressed people. And his father, the man he'd been ashamed of, had quietly built a fortune and was now giving it away. Dale stood there for a long time, looking at the plans, feeling the weight of every year he'd stayed gone. The community meeting was the following Thursday. Earl had asked the town clerk to open the hall for the evening. Word had gone around, but Earl kept the details vague. Everyone knew about the bank incident by now. Nobody knew what was coming next. By 7 o'clock, the hall was packed, folding chairs in rows, people standing along the walls. Louise was near the back. Frank sat in the front row with his arms crossed. Dale stood off to the side, near the door. Earl walked to the front of the room. Someone had set up a microphone, but he didn't use it. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and waited. The room went quiet in about 10 seconds. "Most of you know me," Earl said. "Some of you heard about what happened at the bank a couple weeks ago. I'm not here about that." He paused. "I'm here because of Helen." The room went still. "My wife loved this town. She ran programs at the old community center for 15 years, reading groups, holiday dinners, the Tuesday night accounting class. When that building burned down, she took it hard, harder than she let anyone see." Earl reached into his shirt pocket and touched the glasses. "Before she died, she asked me to rebuild it. She said a town needs a place where people come together, a place that belongs to everyone." He looked around the room. "I'm putting $2 million into a fund to build a new community center. It'll be called the Helen Perkins Memorial Community Center. Construction starts this summer." Silence. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then another person. Then the whole room was on its feet. Louise pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears ran down her face. Frank sat in his chair and didn't clap. He just wiped his eyes with his sleeve and nodded slowly. Earl stood at the front and let it happen. He looked uncomfortable. He always did when people focused on him. But he stayed. If you've made it this far into Earl's story, hit subscribe. Because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Outside the hall, Marcus Webb stood at the window. He'd seen the lights on from his apartment and walked over. He stood in the parking lot, hands in his coat pockets, looking through the glass at the packed room. He heard the applause muffled through the walls. He saw Earl at the front, small and still, while the town stood and cheered around him. Marcus didn't go inside. He just watched. Inside, the crowd slowly settled. People came forward to shake Earl's hand. He accepted each one quietly. A man from the church offered to volunteer on the construction crew. A woman who ran the flower shop said she'd donate landscaping. Then Louise walked up. Most people had moved to the back of the room. Earl was near the front, putting his papers back into the folder. Louise stopped in front of him. Her eyes were red. "Earl." He looked up. "Was it you?" she said. Her voice was barely steady. 5 years ago. My daughter's hospital bills. Every one of them. Was it you?" Earl looked at her. He didn't answer. "I've been wondering for 5 years," Louise said. 5 years, Earl. I think I know." He still didn't speak, but something in his face softened. Not a confession. Just the smallest shift around his eyes. Louise put her arms around him. Earl stood there, one hand still holding the folder, and after a moment placed his other hand on her back and patted it twice. Gently. When she pulled away, she wiped her face. "Thank you," she said. "For my girl. For everything." Earl nodded once. "Your daughter's a good kid, Louise." That was all he said. He never confirmed it. He didn't need to. After the meeting, Dale drove Earl back to the farm. They parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a moment, neither of them moving. "Want to walk?" Earl asked. They walked the property at sunset. The light came in low and gold across the fields, stretching the soybean rows into long shadows. They followed the fence line behind the barn, the same path Earl walked every evening. For a while, neither of them spoke. "Dad," Dale said finally, "I need to tell you something." Earl walked beside him, hands in his pockets. He didn't prompt. "I'm in trouble. Financially. I made a bad investment about 6 months ago. A real estate deal that went sideways. I lost most of my savings." Earl kept walking. "I've got collection notices. A lawyer breathing down my neck. My credit's shot. Dale took a breath. I'm 48 years old and I'm broke. I couldn't even afford a round-trip ticket to get here. Earl was quiet for a few steps. Why didn't you call me? No judgment in his voice. Just a question. Because I was ashamed. Dale stopped walking. I left this place because I was embarrassed by it. The farm, the town, the truck, the overalls. I wanted something bigger, something that looked like success. And I built it and it turned out to be empty. He looked at his father. You were here the whole time. $12 million in the same boots you've worn since I was a kid, planning to give half of it away. And I couldn't manage my own savings. Earl stopped too. He turned to face his son. Dale, I don't care about the money. Not yours, not mine. Money is just a tool. Your mother taught me that. I know. What I care about is that you're standing here. That's what matters. They stood in the fading light. The field stretched out around them, quiet and vast. I could use some help, Earl said, with the community center. The fund is set up, the paperwork's done, but I need somebody to manage the project. Construction, budgets, contractors. I'm too old to run it day to day. Dale looked at him. You're asking me. I'm asking if you want to. Dad, I've managed budgets and timelines for 20 years. This is what I do. Then you'd be good at it. Dale almost smiled. First time in months. Yeah, he said. I'll do it. Earl nodded. They turned and walked back toward the house. The sun dropped below the tree line and the sky went orange and pink above the fields. Back at the town hall, the lights were off. The parking lot was empty. The chairs had been stacked, the microphone put away. Marcus was still there. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking at the dark building. The applause had faded an hour ago. The cars were gone. The street was silent. He thought about what he'd seen through that glass. A room full of people on their feet for a man in overalls. A town rising around someone he dismissed with a glance at a screen. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to his apartment, alone. Ground broke on the first Monday in June. Dale was at the site by 7 in the morning with a clipboard and a hard hat he bought at the hardware store. Frank had laughed at the hard hat. Dale wore it anyway. The lot behind the post office had been cleared and leveled the week before. A construction crew from the next county started pouring the foundation on Tuesday. Dale had hired them after reviewing 4 bids, negotiating the contract, and setting up a payment schedule from the fund. It was work he'd done for corporations for 20 years. The difference was that this time he cared about the building. Earl came every morning. He'd park his truck at the edge of the lot and walk the perimeter slowly, hands behind his back, Helen's glasses in his pocket. He never told anyone what to do. He just watched. Sometimes he'd stop where Helen's reading room would be and stand there for a minute with his eyes closed. Frank came most mornings, too. He'd lean against the fence and offer opinions nobody asked for. That wall needs more bracing, he'd say. The engineer says it's fine, Frank. The engineer hasn't lived through a tornado in this county. Dale added the bracing. The project moved fast. Dale put in 12-hour days, 6 days a week. He built a spreadsheet for the budget, a timeline for the contractors, a punch list for every phase. He held weekly meetings with the crew foreman and the architect Earl had hired from the next town. He tracked every dollar against the fund. It was the first time in years his work felt like it meant something. 3 weeks into construction, on a Wednesday afternoon, Marcus Webb walked into the diner. Earl was at the counter, third stool, coffee and eggs. It was midweek, not his usual Saturday, but he'd started coming in more often since the project began. Luis poured his coffee without being asked. Marcus stood just inside the door. He was wearing khakis and a button-down, no tie. He looked different than he had behind the desk at the bank, smaller somehow. Luis glanced at him, then at Earl. 4 other people sat in the diner. All of them looked up. Marcus walked to the counter and stopped 2 stools away from Earl. "Mr. Perkins," he said. Earl turned his head slightly. "Marcus, do you have a minute? I'd like to talk to you." Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the stool beside him. Marcus sat down. Louise brought him a glass of water. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. "A real one. Not the kind where I say the words and hope it goes away." Earl drank his coffee. He listened. "I looked at you that day and I saw a number. $14. I saw your clothes and your age, and I decided before you finished sitting down. That was wrong." "Yes," Earl said. "It was. It wasn't just about the money. I didn't see you as a person. I saw what I expected to see, and I stopped looking. Doris told me about the trust, your wife, everything you've done for this town. I should have known. I should have spent 10 minutes reading the file." Earl set his cup down. He turned on the stool to face Marcus. "Let me tell you something," Earl said. You remind me of my son when he was young. Too busy looking at what things cost to see what they're worth. Marcus took that without flinching. My wife spent 50 years investing money we never touched, Earl continued. She could have had a nice house, a new car, anything she wanted. But she said the money wasn't for us. It was for what we could do with it. That lesson takes some people a while. Marcus nodded. I didn't walk into that bank because I needed $5,000, Earl said. I walked in because I was about to put $2 million into this town, and I wanted to know if the man running the bank was somebody I could work with. And I failed. You failed the first one. Doesn't mean you can't pass the next. Marcus looked at him. What do you mean? I need somebody to manage the fund's finances at the bank. Disbursements, contractor payments, the accounting side of it. Doris is retiring next year. I need someone who knows numbers and who's going to stick around. Marcus sat up straighter. You're asking me to manage the fund. I'm asking if you're willing to do the work. Not because it looks good on a report, because it matters. Yes, Marcus said. I'm willing. Good. Talk to Dale. He'll walk you through the budget. Earl went back to his coffee. Marcus sat for a moment, then stood. Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Earl. Thank you, Earl. He left the diner. Louise watched him go, then looked at Earl. You sure about that? She asked. No, Earl said. But Helen always said, you learn more about a man from his second chance than his first mistake. 2 days later, Marcus was at the construction site with a laptop and a chair he'd carried from the bank. Dale walked him through the budget line by line. They spent 3 hours together. By the end, Marcus had reorganized the payment schedule and found a way to save $8,000 on materials. Dale called Earl that night. He's sharp, Dad. He actually knows what he's doing. I figured. Then why'd you test him? Knowing numbers isn't the same as seeing people. I needed to find out if he could do both. The weeks went by. The frame went up, then the walls, then the roof. People came to help. Not because anyone asked them to, but because the project had become something the whole town owned. A retired carpenter showed up on Tuesday mornings and worked until noon. 3 women from the church organized a painting crew. A farmer 2 roads over donated a truckload of lumber from his barn that he'd been saving for a project he never started. Frank stood at the fence and watched. Looking good, he said to Dale. One afternoon. You say that every day, because every day it's a little more true. Dale leaned on the fence beside him. They watched the crew frame the last interior wall. Frank, can I ask you something? Going to anyway. Was he angry? When I left. When I stopped coming home, Frank was quiet for a while. He looked out at the building instead of at Dale. Your father never stopped being proud of you, Dale. He just stopped saying it out loud. Dale looked at him. He's got a box in the closet upstairs, Frank said. Every article you were mentioned in, consulting awards, client newsletters, anything with your name. Helen used to clip them and mail them to him. After she passed, he kept doing it himself. Printed things off the computer. He doesn't know how to work a computer worth a damn, but he figured out how to find your name and print the page. Dale turned away. He gripped the fence with both hands. He never said a word to me about any of that, Dale said. That's your father. He shows what he feels by what he does. Always has. They stood there for a while, watching the building take shape. Marcus started coming to the site regularly. He'd stop by after work, still in his dress shirt, and ask Dale what needed doing. At first, people eyed him, the banker who'd turned Earl away. But Marcus kept showing up. He carried boards. He held levels. He brought coffee for the crew on cold mornings. One Saturday, he drove to the city and came back with his wife and daughter. Sarah was a quiet woman with a sharp eye. She walked through the half-finished building and asked Dale detailed questions about the layout, the capacity, the programming plan. Their daughter, 5 years old, sat on a stack of lumber and drew pictures with a marker on scrap wood. This is a good thing, Sarah told Marcus that evening, standing outside the building as the sun went down. This is worth being here for. Marcus looked at her. He hadn't said it out loud yet, but he'd already called the regional office about making his transfer permanent. By September, the building had walls, a roof, and the beginning of an interior. Dale's reading room, the one Earl had sketched on graph paper, had built-in bookshelves that a local woodworker crafted by hand from reclaimed oak. The days shortened. The work continued. On a quiet Thursday evening in early October, Earl and Dale sat on the farmhouse porch. The air had gone cool. Crickets sang in the dark beyond the garden. Earl had 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Dale and sat in his chair. Helen's chair was empty on the right. Building's almost done, Earl said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Inspector comes Monday. You've done a good job, Dale. Dale looked at his coffee. I had a good project. They sat in the quiet. Then Earl reached into his flannel pocket, not the shirt pocket where he kept Helen's glasses. The other one. He pulled out something small and held it in his open palm. A ring, gold, worn smooth from decades of wear, with a single small diamond that caught the porch light. Your mother's wedding ring, Earl said. She took it off when her hands swelled during the treatments, asked me to hold it. Dale stared at it. She told me to give it to you when the time was right. Earl held out his hand. I think this is the time. Dale reached out and took the ring. It was warm from Earl's pocket, lighter than he expected. He turned it in his fingers. She was proud of you, Dale. Never stopped being proud, not even when you stopped calling. Dale closed his hand around the ring. His jaw was tight, but he held steady. I'm staying, Dad. Earl looked at him. I'm not going back to Chicago. I'm going to stay and help run the center. There's nothing for me there anymore. Earl was quiet for a moment. He took a sip of coffee and looked out at the dark fields. Good, he said. I could use the company. Dale slipped the ring into his shirt pocket, the same pocket where his father kept Helen's glasses. He didn't think about it. It just felt right. They sat on the porch and listened to the crickets. Inside the house, the kitchen light was on, and the folder of plans was still on the table. The pages covered in 2 different sets of handwriting now, Earl's small, cramped letters on the original sketches, Dale's neat print in the margins, numbers and notes and room dimensions, layered together across months of work. The building was almost finished. The town had already changed, and 2 men who'd lost each other somewhere in the last 30 years were sitting 3 feet apart on a porch, drinking coffee in the dark, not needing to say another word. The Helen Perkins Memorial Community Center opened on the second Saturday in November. The building stood on the lot behind the post office where weeds had grown for 4 years. It was bigger than the old center and newer, with large windows that let the morning light fill every room, but it had the same feeling. A place that belonged to everyone who walked through the door. Dale had been there since 6 in the morning, checking every room, every outlet, every door handle. He'd worn a path in the new floor, pacing back and forth. The caterer arrived at 8. The piano tuner came at 8:30. By 9, the folding tables in the main hall were set with white cloths and trays of food from 3 different places in the county. Frank showed up at 9:15 and stood in the doorway. Not bad, he said. You've said that every day for 4 months, Frank, because every day it got a little more true. People started arriving before 10. Cars lined the street. Families walked in, looked around, touched the walls. Children ran down the hallways and slid on the smooth new floors. The building filled with noise and laughter and the smell of fresh paint and baked ham. Earl pulled up in his truck at 10:30. He parked in the back, away from the crowd, and sat in the cab for a moment. He reached into his pocket and held Helen's glasses. We did it, Helen, he said quietly. He put the glasses back and walked around to the front entrance. Above the main door, a wooden plaque had been mounted the day before, dark walnut, hand-carved. It read, Helen Perkins Memorial Community Center. A town is only as strong as its kindest people. Earl stood below it and read the words twice. Dale had picked the quote. It was something Helen used to say at the dinner table, at church, at the old center when she was stacking chairs after an event. Earl had heard her say it a hundred times. Seeing it carved into wood above a door she'd dreamed about made his chest tight in a way he hadn't expected. He went inside. The main hall was full. Over 100 people, maybe more. Every chair taken, people standing along the walls. The mood was different from the town meeting months ago. That had been surprise and tears. This was celebration. People were smiling, talking, laughing. Children wove between the adults. Someone had taped a banner across the far wall. Welcome home. Dale found Earl near the entrance and guided him to the front of the room. A small podium had been set up. Earl had told Dale twice he didn't want a microphone. Dale had set one up anyway. Earl stood at the podium. He didn't touch the microphone. The room went quiet on its own. It took about 10 seconds. I'm not going to talk long, he said. Helen wouldn't have wanted that. She'd have wanted the food hot, the coffee ready, and the kids doing something. A few people laughed. This building exists because of her. She dreamed about it for years, talked about it on drives into town, talked about it at the kitchen table, talked about it in the hospital, when talking at all was hard. The room was very still. Helen believed a town wasn't just a place where people happened to live near each other. She said it was a place where people looked after each other, where somebody's trouble became everybody's concern, where people showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He paused. His hand went to the glasses in his pocket, briefly, then came back down. She was the best person I ever knew. 53 years she spent making me better than I would have been alone. When she asked me to build this place, I said I would. He looked out at the room. So here it is. He stepped back from the podium. The room stood and the applause was immediate and full. People clapped with their hands up high, the way people do when something matters. Frank sat in the front row and didn't clap. He just wiped his eyes with his sleeve and nodded once, slowly, the way he did when something was exactly right. When the applause faded, Dale stepped to the front. "We have someone who'd like to help us open this place properly," he said. "Some of you know her." A girl walked to the front of the room, 12 years old, tall for her age, dark hair in a ponytail. She sat down at the upright piano that the elementary school's music teacher had donated. Louise stood near the back, both hands pressed together against her mouth. The girl played, a simple piece. Clean, clear, unhurried. Her fingers moved over the keys without hesitation. The room listened. 5 years ago, this girl had been in a hospital bed. The doctors had told Louise to prepare herself. The bills kept coming. The treatments were uncertain. Louise had worked double shifts and sold what she could and still fell behind. And then one day, the bills just stopped. Louise watched her daughter play and let the tears come. She didn't wipe them. She just stood there, listening, holding on to this moment with everything she had. When the piece ended, the room applauded again. The girl smiled and walked back to her mother. Louise put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and held her tight. Earl watched them from across the room. He didn't say anything, he just watched. The celebration spread through the building. People explored the rooms, the kitchen, the meeting spaces, the storage area Dale had insisted on because he'd learned from years of project management that every building needs more storage than the architect thinks. A group of children found Helen's reading room in the back, with its built-in bookshelves already half filled with donated books. 2 girls immediately pulled books off the shelves and sat on the floor to read. Marcus came with Sarah and their daughter. They walked through the front entrance together, Marcus carrying the girl on his hip. Some people nodded at them. Others looked away. The town hadn't fully forgiven the bank incident, and probably never would entirely, but most had seen Marcus at the construction site over the past months, carrying lumber, bringing coffee, doing the work. That counted for something. Sarah walked through the building slowly, looking at the rooms, the light, the people. She stopped in the main hall and watched the crowd. "You were right to stay," she said to Marcus. He nodded. The permanent transfer paperwork had gone through the week before. Their daughter squirmed down from his arms and ran toward the reading room, where the other children were. Marcus watched her go and something loosened in his chest. In the early afternoon, Marcus found Earl in Helen's reading room. The bookshelf smelled like fresh-cut oak. Sunlight came through the window and fell across the floor in warm squares. "Earl," Marcus said from the doorway. Earl turned. Marcus walked in and extended his hand. "Thank you for the second chance, for trusting me with the fund, for everything you've done for this town." Earl looked at him. Then he took Marcus's hand, not the quick shake of a banking transaction. A firm, full grip. 2 men who had started badly and worked their way to something honest. "You earned it," Earl said. Marcus smiled. It was small and real. "Your daughter seems happy," Earl said. "She keeps asking when we're officially moving here." "Smart girl." Marcus laughed. It was a quiet sound, but genuine. He went back to find his family. Late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the caterers were packing trays, Frank and Earl sat together on folding chairs in the corner of the main hall. Paper plates and coffee cups still dotted the tables. Children's drawings were taped to the wall near the door, made during a session someone had organized with markers and butcher paper. Frank leaned back and looked at the ceiling. "Helen would have loved this," he said. Earl reached into his pocket and touched the glasses. "She would have liked this," he said. "Helen always said a town was only as strong as its kindest people." Frank nodded. She was right. Usually was? Remember when she organized that Thanksgiving dinner the year the ice storm knocked the power out? Whole town in this building, eating by candlelight? She made 14 pies, Earl said. 14? I told her nobody needed 14 pies. She told me I didn't know what people needed. Frank smiled. She was right about that too. Always was. They sat for a while. Dale walked past carrying a stack of empty trays to the kitchen. He waved and kept moving. Louise's daughter ran through the hall with 2 other kids, all of them laughing about something. The sound bounced off the new walls and filled the room. "He's staying?" Frank asked, watching Dale disappear into the kitchen. "He's staying. Good boy." "He's 48, Frank. Still a good boy." Earl almost smiled. He looked around the room. The tables, the chairs, the banner, the children's drawings. the plaque above the door that he could see from where he sat with Helen's words carved into it. He'd promised her this. In a hospital room, holding her hand, her body failing and her voice still steady. She'd asked him for this one thing, and he'd said yes. 2 years, a $12 million secret, a denied loan, a son who came home, a banker who learned, and a town that remembered how to gather. That was what it took. Earl wouldn't have done it any other way. Dale came out of the kitchen and sat down beside Earl and Frank. "Building's holding up pretty well for its first day," Dale said. "Give it a week," Frank said. "The plumbing will start complaining." "Frank, you said that about every building in this town, and I've been right about every one." Dale laughed. Earl shook his head. Frank grinned. The three of them sat there as the last of the daylight came through the big windows. 2 old men and a middle-aged one, in a new building named after a woman who would have been in the kitchen right now, making sure everyone got fed. After a while, Earl stood. "I'm heading home," he said. "Want me to drive you?" Dale asked. "I've got the truck. Dad, it's getting dark. I've been driving that road in the dark for 55 years. I think I can manage one more." Dale didn't argue. He'd learned in the last few months that arguing with Earl was like arguing with weather. You could do it, but the weather didn't care. Earl shook Frank's hand. He put his hand on Dale's shoulder and squeezed once. Then he walked out the back door to his truck. The parking lot was mostly empty now. 3 cars, his truck, and the caterer's van. The air was cold and smelled like dry leaves and wood smoke from somebody's chimney. Earl climbed into the cab and sat there. He looked at the building in the rearview mirror. The lights were still on inside. He could see people moving past the windows. Dale and Frank, probably. A few others finishing the cleanup. The glow was warm and yellow against the gray November sky. He started the engine. It coughed twice and turned over. He drove east, out of town. The field stretched out on both sides of the road, flat and bare. The soybeans had been harvested weeks ago, and the soil was dark and waiting for winter. The same road he'd driven in April, the morning he'd walked out of the bank with $12 million on a screen behind him. Same road, same truck, same man in the same seat. But the passenger side felt different tonight. Not the ache that had been there for 2 years. Something quieter, something settled. He turned onto the gravel drive. The farmhouse stood in the last light. White paint, green shutters. Helen's garden, done for the season, the beds covered in mulch and ready for spring. Earl parked and climbed out. He stood in the yard for a moment the way he always did. He could hear a dog barking somewhere far off. The wind moved through the bare branches above the porch. He walked up the steps, past the 2 chairs. He stopped at the front door and reached into his pocket. Helen's glasses, wireframes, the small scratch on the left lens. He'd carried them every day for 2 years. Through the bank, the meeting, the construction, the opening, through every conversation and every quiet moment and every morning walk around the building site. He held them for a moment. Then he opened the door, walked inside, and set the glasses on the kitchen table. Not in a drawer, not put away, just placed down gently, next to the folder of plans, in the spot where Helen used to sit. The kitchen was quiet, the house was quiet. But it felt different now. Not empty, just still. The good kind of still. Earl put the kettle on. He sat down at the table and looked out the window. The last bit of light had faded and the fields were dark. Same view he'd had for 55 years. He picked up his coffee when it was ready and held it in both hands. The warmth felt good. He didn't say anything to Helen tonight. He didn't need to. She already knew.